Can do is more than just an attitude. Can do is navigating today for a brighter tomorrow. It's the expertise to try to minimize risk while maximizing opportunities. Can do is being right here for you through every eventuality. Can do is Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management. Visit candowealth.com to see how we can help you build your wealth with confidence. Investment involves risk, and you may not get back what you invest. It's not suitable for everyone.
It's the week ending Saturday the 14th of October, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Israel declaring war on the Gaza Strip after an unprecedented attack by the armed Palestinian group Hamas. Ex-Formula One boss Bernie Ecclestone pleading guilty to fraud charges, and the UK and Ireland being confirmed as the hosts for the Euro 2028 football tournament. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Arion McNicoll. Let's unwrap the week. And Olly's away this week, so I'm back in your ears. And joining me today from the week's digital team, it's the boss man Holden Frith and Rebekah Evans, plus the man for all financial seasons from Money Week, it's Mr. Guy Anker. And Rebekah, you're up first this week. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
England's housing crisis. Just another brick in the wall?
There's this perception that because we don't have Victorian-style slums anymore that things are sorted, but people are living in slum-like conditions.
Something has to give. People are living in squalor.
Inside Britain's slum-like social housing crisis, a video from the iPaper released last year. Rebekah, what's the story this week?
So, a new report from the Home Builders Federation says that England is now officially the worst place in the developed world for housing. That report has provided a snapshot of the ongoing housing crisis, and that's an issue on the lips of many, but arguably is yet to be properly addressed in policy. Now, the report and the conversation around it, I think, is likely to make politicians who are prepping for a general election a bit more concerned about the quality of housing, and I think it could be a pivotal voting issue.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I'm sure most people in the UK will have started to recognise, but maybe the headline that Britain is the very worst place in the world might take at least some people by surprise. What's led us to this point?
Well, I don't think you could come across many people, as you say, Arion, that don't see that there's a housing crisis in this country on multiple levels. I mean, there's a rental catastrophe that's unfolding right now with high demand and high prices and real struggles for first-time buyers who are trying to get on the market. And of course, those who are already on the property ladder are facing a mortgage bomb, which was arguably exacerbated by the disastrous mini-budget of last year. I think all of these things have real-world implications and are affecting, different factors and facets of our society in different ways.
Yeah, so Holden, who is being impacted the most with this, would you say?
One of the groups that this report has focused on in particular is people in private rental housing. And I think that's partly because this is a group that's expanding and has been expanding over the past several years and not really through the choice of the people who find themselves in that group. In the general way the housing market has worked in the UK in the past is that people, and particularly people at the better off end of the spectrum, have tended to rent privately for a few years and then move fairly quickly into the owner-occupier end of the market. Whereas because prices have been rising so much more quickly than wages, that just hasn't been possible for a whole group of people who expected it to.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose as Holden's saying, there are so many different parts to this problem, but it's not just the issue, Guy, that housing is unaffordable and unavailable, but this report also talks about how dire some of the living conditions are for people. Why is it that we have started to accept these things like, mouldy floors and rot in window frames? Why do we here in Britain accept this sort of housing?
It's a nightmare, isn't it? Look, I don't know why precisely, I can only speculate, but I don't think we maintain our homes like we need to. Listen, part of the problem is, it's a bit like the London Underground. When you were one of the first people to do it, it's old by now. And I think that's part of the issue with our housing stock. We're a nation that has had the sorts of houses you see now for hundreds of years. And there comes a point, of course, where things start to go wrong. We obviously just haven't been keeping the upkeep. You've seen recently, it's not so much about private homes, but you've seen the scandal around dodgy concrete used in schools. That's another example. That's part of the problem. Something I've talked about on this podcast before as well is blocks of flats where the cladding is unsafe or the insulation behind them is unsafe, and their potential fire risks. And there's another risk, another Grenfell happens again in the worst case scenario. So there's more than just damp, mold, and what you've talked about. And I agree with Rebekah. This is just yet another piece of the jigsaw of the housing crisis that we're in. And let me also just introduce another issue here. I used to actually sit on a industry panel around green homes, and one of the pieces that often came out was just how poorly insulated our homes are. But for the similar reasons we're talking, the housing stock is very old. For example, 37% of homes in the UK were built before 1946. And some research done by an energy firm called Tado, a few years ago, it came up with some very interesting analysis. It examined 80,000 homes in 11 European countries between December 2019 and January 2020. And it found a home in the UK with an indoor temperature of 20 degrees Celsius and outside of 0 loses 3 degrees on average after 5 hours. That was the worst of all the results in all the different European countries it did research in. Interestingly, Norway and Germany fared best. So that's just another example of issues that we have in our housing stock.
Yeah, I mean, so many of these things that you're talking about, Guy, the business of there being too few houses and also too little imperative to move towards green homes, these sound like the sorts of things that governments could actually get involved with. So, Rebekah, why is the government not doing more, particularly, I suppose, in the area of house construction?
I think that's a really interesting question. I think that's something that they only can answer. It's just baffling to me that government is not addressing it, really. It's an issue that so many people are talking about, and it affects all of our lives. We all live in homes, whether that be houses or apartments or otherwise. And yeah, I think this is why I think it will be such a key issue to touch upon in the upcoming general election. I mean, we only have to look at party conferences over the last couple of weeks to see how the different parties have addressed this. I mean, Rishi Sunak had a 7,500 word speech and he didn't mention the housing crisis once. Is that because it's happened on his party's watch, or is it because Tories have a base of older voters who perhaps aren't as impacted by the housing crisis? Then you look at the Liberal Democrats, who their conference was arguably totally dominated by the housing crisis and different opinions on that. And Labour this week have unveiled their plans to build 1.5 million new homes in the next 5 years if they take government. So yeah, I think this will be a problem for Rishi Sunak, which other parties could potentially seize on as why he's not addressing this.
Yeah, I suppose it's looking increasingly likely that the next government will be a Labour government. Holden, if that comes to pass, what are Keir Starmer's plans in relation to housing?
He has said that Labour would build 1.5 million new homes in 5 years, so 300,000 a year. And if that number sounds familiar, that's because that was also the Conservative target until Rishi Sunak abandoned it at the end of last year. So there is going to be some scepticism about this new pledge, but Starmer is at least talking the talk. He said on Wednesday, when he was asked on Radio 4 if he was prepared to overrule local planning objections, and he said quite straightforwardly, yes, we are going to have to do that, which is a departure from the usual platitudes about consulting with communities, listening to local opinion. But I think, the answer to that question of why haven't governments done more about this is because as much as people tend to be in favour of building new homes in the abstract, they tend to be very much against them when they're going to be built next to their own homes. And so there has just always been that reluctance to face down the opposition that comes when you turn a proposal into actual buildings. It sounds like Labour's going to try this. Whether they will or not, we'll have to wait and see. But I think that there could be a political advantage to this for them, in that if, one of the criticisms of Keir Starmer is that he doesn't really stand for anything. So perhaps just by picking a fight, even if some people end up on the wrong side of it, he will gain some respect for that. And that might be a reason for him to carry this through where other politicians haven't.
Well, I suppose one of the other dangers of Keir Starmer fighting that fight is the common concern that if you build too many houses, you lose natural environment. Is this a threat, Guy, if too many houses go up too quickly?
Well, that's why you've got protections, haven't you, around green belts? I know there's talk of the grey belt as well. But look, one way or another, one element of the housing crisis is the lack of supply. The lack of supply means there's less choice. It means prices are higher. It's supply and demand economics, and this is one of the key things that's fueling the dramatic price increases we've seen over the years. And I don't think this is about Tory, Labour, or Lib Dem. I'm not sure it's a party political issue. This has been an issue for decades. Although we have seen particularly steep rises recently, but we've seen steep rises all across the world. So I think this is more of a macroeconomic issue. Lots of cities around the world, lots of countries around the world are having very similar conversations to what we're having about price, not necessarily about damp, mold, dodgy concrete and cladding, but certainly on the price and the interest rate side, the same conversations are happening. These pledges of new homes, I'll be honest with you, I hear them, sometimes they go in one ear out the other. I've been covering this stuff for about 20 years now, and I've heard it so many times. When there's been a Labour government, when there's been a coalition government, when there's been a Tory government, I've heard we're going to build this number of new homes. And I've got to be honest with you, I think most people are the same. They're like, okay, whatever, next, please. What's something that's actually going to impact me? And going back to Rebekah's original point, I think, the quality of our homes and the fact some are crumbling, literally in the case of some schools, well, that's not homes, but they're buildings, and it's part of the same picture. Point some buildings are crumbling. The point some apartment blocks are fire risks. The point of unacceptable damp and mold, which is literally killing people in some cases, rare cases, but nevertheless, it's horrible. I think that's much more tangible things that would actually get people interested.
I mean, on the question of when might be the right time to buy a house, do we have a sense of that, Guy, or is there still no clarity on whether it's now or significantly further in the future?
I'm going to consult my crystal ball, Arion, and I'll tell you in a second. No, in all seriousness, nobody knows. This is the age-old question. When's the right time to buy a house? When's the right time to sell my shares? When's the right time to trade in currency? None of us know. What I would really stress to people looking for homes, and I'm in this boat, by the way, myself at the moment, it's about what's the right time for you and your family situation, your financial situation. You can't call the market. We just don't know what's going to happen. Nobody knew COVID was coming along. Nobody knew the financial crisis was coming along in 2007, 2008, and so on and so forth. Big shocks that can affect us. Prices are going up. I know they've come down a little bit recently, but over time they're going up. They might continue to go up. They might go down. I don't know. I've got no idea. Anyone that tells you they know is a liar. It's all about your situation at the time. If you need a bigger home, if you need your first home, if you can afford it, if you can get a mortgage rate that's good for you, go ahead and do it, because buying a home isn't just about the financial aspect. It's about having a roof over your head. It's about a place that's home. It's the emotional connection to it as well. Nobody, unfortunately, can tell anyone with any certainty when the best time is.
Yeah, well, I'm actually moving to Australia myself, so in a sense, this is a problem I'm leaving to you guys, though it's not much better in Australia, it must be said. But I mean, this is a problem that affects so many countries, and there are a range of different solutions to it. Japan solves the problem of insufficient housing with lax planning laws, Singapore with government-funded housing. Holden, what can we learn from other countries' responses to this particular issue?
Say, looking slightly closer to hand in mainland Europe, the big difference between the UK situation and theirs is that we don't really have a big institutional private rental sector. It's much more ad hoc with individual landlords, often people who've moved out of a flat or home, maybe when they're moving in with a partner and they keep the old property and rent that out. And I think that is a significant contributor to the sorts of poor conditions that exist in some rental flats, because there isn't that institutional backing or experience or kind of willingness to shell out money on maintenance, perhaps at a time, particularly when mortgage rates are going up on those properties. Whereas if you look at places like Germany, France, Switzerland, a lot of the rental properties are A, big apartment blocks, but B, owned by pension funds and other really big companies that are, while perhaps not perfect, have much more experience at keeping those standards to a minimum. And people expect to rent for most, if not all, of their lives. And so you have people across the income scale or renting. And it's not that situation of it being seen as an undesirable stepping stone to something else. It's a goal in itself to have a good rental property and a good stock of rental homes within the national housing stock.
All right, Guy, you're up next after this.
Can do is more than just an attitude. Can do is navigating today for a brighter tomorrow. It's the expertise to try to minimize risk while maximizing opportunities. Can do is being right here for you through every eventuality. Can do is Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management. Visit candowealth.com to see how we can help you build your wealth with confidence. Investment involves risk, and you may not get back what you invest. It's not suitable for everyone.
Okay, Guy, what do you think this week should be remembered for?
Are our banks safe?
Very idiosyncratic things were happening at Metro Bank. There's various reasons investors had kind of been spooked over the previous month or so. And I think, what we are seeing is a new Metro Bank emergence. Now Galinsky has will have a 53% stake. That's up from about 9%. And it's interesting that really, over the weekend, there's all sorts of sort of rumours and stories flying around. Might there be a white knight? Ultimately, what happened is the existing investors were, effectively made the decision they will go in, retain some kind of control, etc., and put a lot of more money in the bank.
Tom Metcalf from Bloomberg News speaking on Bloomberg TV on Monday. Guy, what exactly has happened this week?
Well, after some financial wobbles, Metro Bank has clinched what is essentially a rescue package, which means anyone with money in Metro, anyone working for Metro, anyone that cares about the banking industry can rest that little bit easier.
So obviously this is a fast-moving story, but maybe you could give us some of the backstory on Metro Bank. How exactly did we get to this point?
Now, first of all, I should say, I think, nobody gets unduly anxious. Metro Bank looks like it's okay, but let's go now back in time. So it's had the most recent news is it's had a massive cash injection because it ran into some problems. It asked regulators not long ago to reduce the amount of money it held in reserve to cover mortgage lending. That would have freed up more cash that could go out and continue to grow the business. But regulators turned this down last month. That in itself knocked 20% off the share price. And last week, the bank's share price dropped even further following reports it was seeking to raise money from investors. And it led to several days of speculation about the bank's future until this fundraising deal came around late on Sunday. So it looks like it's got the injection it needs. But the UK banking in general is often teetering on a bit of a cliff edge at times, because you've got to hold. If you're massive and you long-standing, if you've got billions, you're okay. But if not, you've got this complexity where if you want to lend money out, you need a certain amount of money in reserve. Like Arion, if you said to me, Guy, can I have £100 off you? And I have lots, and I had lots of money. I'm quite happy to lend you £100.
This podcast is going great so far. It's just turning out really well for me.
If you don't pay it back, it's not the end of the world because I've got lots of money sitting behind me. But if I didn't have lots of money sitting behind me, I'd be less likely to lend that money to you because it might be my last £100. In that, very, very, very small and unrealistic scenario, that's kind of just a microcosm of what banks have to go through. And Metro Bank basically needed more money, needed more capital for it to be able to lend money and then grow. It was denied that originally. And there were fears for a few days, not that it was going to go bust, let's say, but it was going to get into serious trouble. But you never know. We all know, we've seen instances in our lifetimes of banks going bust. Not long ago, in fact, only 6 months ago in the US, a number of smaller banks went into administration. They really struggled because they were gambling on low interest rates, and suddenly interest rates went up and their books weren't balancing, and unfortunately they went. And lots of depositors in the US naturally got worried. There is a deposit protection scheme like there is here, but it wasn't a nice period for I would say for Metro Bank, for people that have money with Metro Bank. But it sounds like things are on the up now, or at least on the steady.
So, Guy, at the top of this piece, you suggested that Metro Bank is out of immediate danger. Holden, do you think our banks are safe generally?
I don't think you can ever say with absolute certainty that every bank is safe. But I think, as I was looking into the details of this, I became more reassured the more I found out about it. One of the reasons that Metro Bank started to get into trouble was that the Bank of England, which is the banking regulator in the UK, has rules that it put in place after the big credit crunch and financial crisis of 2008, 2009, and they require that sort of capital backing for any loans on the books. And Metro Bank had actually asked for a bit more leeway in how those rules were applied and to be able to calculate the risk attached to its own mortgages. And the Bank of England had said no. And so I think that was unfortunate for Metro Bank and caused this sort of lack of confidence that has since been stemmed by finding new investors. I think it actually should lead to more confidence for the rest of us that there is that there are rules in place and they are being enforced more stringently than they were back in the 2010s.
Yeah, I mean, Rebekah, when Metro began around 2010, it positioned itself as a so-called challenger bank to the big high street names. Has it fulfilled that promise? I mean, it's a shaky period at the moment, but has it delivered on that challenge to the big four in particular?
I think that's an interesting point. I think challenger banks as a whole, but we're talking about Metro here, I don't think they've necessarily cracked the code yet. And I think maybe that's just a time thing. I mean, Metro was the first high street bank to open in over 100 years. This is a market that's been locked tight for decades, quite literally a century. So challenger banks, even though they're becoming more popular, they might not be operating at a profit or even operating at a loss. And obviously that's a huge issue for them. But they'll be wanting to capture more customers away from the high street providers. That's their modus operandi. And that's hard within itself, right? I mean, we're all familiar with the high street providers, the Lloyds, the NatWest, the HSBC, and we've been banking with them for years. So to switch away from that might make people feel uneasy. But then there's also the issue, I think, of inertia. It's been proven time and time again with banking that many people don't want to switch. Will have the same bank account with the same provider for 20, 30, 40 years. And I think that presents a particular challenge for these challenger banks.
Yeah, I mean, Guy, you often come on this show and encourage people to consider challenger banks as a legitimate alternative. Do you think part of the problem is that the challenger banks haven't done a good job of selling themselves as a credible alternative to people?
I don't know. I mean, I think Metro had some good rates. I remember just after it launched, it was very good for things like spending abroad. Its current account was fairly attractive. But Rebekah's right. There is a lot of inertia around switching your current account. I'm going to separate that from the rest for a second. I think there's data out in the past. You're more likely to switch your partner than you are your bank at times. It's why banks invest so much in their presence on things like freshers' fairs at universities, because they know if they can get you through the door at that point, you might well stay with them for a long time. I was paying a friend of mine the other day some money I owed him, and I saw his sort code, and I remember that was the Barclays on the Sussex Uni campus where we went to. I still remember it, and that's 20 years ago. I go, mate, come on, anyway. So people are less likely to switch. Metro, I remember when it started, and I was invited along with lots of journalists at the time to its branch in Holborn in London, and to see what it was all about. It was positioning itself as slightly different. Anyone that's been in any of its branches will know it feels more like a hotel lobby. And I can remember, because I think the founder was a dog lover, and I'm pretty sure, this is from memory, I'm pretty sure one of their offerings was dog treats and little things like you could go in and put all your coins in a little machine. It would spit out notes, or it'd spit out a token you can take to the counter to get notes. It was trying to do things differently. But it's very difficult to get people to switch their current account. It's very different for things like savings. People do open accounts with challenger banks. So I don't know enough about their underlying business model to know whether that in itself has caused a problem. But one thing I would say, and Holden picked up on this, is, I put in my blurb at the top, are our banks safe? I think the answer to that question is they're as safe as they were 2 weeks ago before we knew about this. I'm not going to say they're completely safe, because you never know what's around the corner. But the issues with Metro Bank were very specific to Metro Bank. And I just want to ease anyone's sense of anxiety if it exists. I don't think anybody should listen to this slot thinking my money's any less safe than it was. And really importantly, even if your bank went bust, as long as you would put your money with a regulated financial institution, you are protected up to £85,000 per person, per institution in the UK. And it has unfortunately been that has had to pay out at times in the past, but it's paid out at times in the past. So, people can save with that comfort blanket.
Yeah, Holden, the new controlling shareholder riding to Metro Bank's rescue is a Colombian billionaire. What do we know about him?
Yeah, he has a fascinating past, actually. Jaime Galinsky Bacal is his name. And he's made a speciality out of turning troubled banks around, often much more troubled than Metro Bank, in fact. He came to prominence in 1991 when, at the age of just 33, he bought some of the remnants of the Bank of Credit and Commerce International. And people of my age or older will probably at least recognize the initials BCCI and associate them with a very long and complicated scandal. And having refreshed my memory this morning, it turns out that BCCI was one of the world's largest private banks, had been heavily involved in money laundering for drugs cartels, and then was targeted by sting operations by US law enforcement and eventually came tumbling down. When that happened, Galinsky bought up what was left of the Colombian assets of that bank, rebuilt them all into a credible operation, totally above board, sold it a few years later at a huge profit. He actually already had a bit of a connection to Metro Bank through his daughter, who's also a banker and a businesswoman, and she sat on the Metro Bank board. But he's now putting in £100 million of his own money, presumably because he sees the opportunity to do something similar here, albeit on a slightly less dramatic scale.
Yeah, so Rebekah, what does all this mean for banking? Not only this new controlling shareholder, but, the wobbles themselves. What does this mean for the banking system in the UK?
I mean, I think banking is at a crossroads at the moment. We're seeing more of a move online, and that results in branch closures right across the country. I mean, we're looking at roughly 5,000 branch closures since 2015. And I think that presents a whole different conversation about, the challenges for people who are elderly or vulnerable or those who struggle with online access. But with that being said, I think Metro has an interesting conundrum on its hands in the sense that, as Guy identified, it entered the market trying to do something different, and it has increased the number of branches over the last however long it's been operating. It has a focus on bricks and mortar banking, and I think it will obviously now be seeing a physical gap on the high street as well as a gap in the market with its competitors shutting up shop. But there are definitely overheads to think about there. I mean, it's not necessarily viable, and that's why everyone is all of the providers that we're familiar with are closing their branches. It's all about keeping costs low, and Metro and other banks might have to rethink their approach if they want to stop hemorrhaging money and retain cash injections like we've seen with this circumstance in Metro. So I definitely think it will be interesting to keep an eye on.
Okay, well, I'm closing this particular branch. Holden, you're up next after this. Holden, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Why we still have lessons to learn from 1918.
The symptoms are very graphic and very, very striking. So, it's said that some people drowned in their own phlegm. So if it was hitting or affecting the lungs, people were spurting blood from their ears and their noses. Descriptions of people turning blue or purple. So, it was really, really severe, and people just dropping down in the streets.
Dr. Mary Dobson, a historian of medicine at the University of Cambridge. Holden, that sounded awful. What was she describing?
She was describing the effects of the Spanish flu pandemic, which began in 1918. And the reason it's news this week is that we have some new information about how it wreaked such a terrible toll, and it really was a terrible toll, second only to the Black Death in terms of the number of people it killed, a total of somewhere between 50 and 100 million people between 1918 and 1920.
Okay, so breaking news about the year 1918. How does this change what we've learned this week, what we know about that pandemic over 100 years ago?
Well, one of the few things that was widely known about the Spanish flu, apart from the fact that it didn't start in Spain, was that unlike most other variants of flu, it was said that it was just as likely to kill healthy people as it was the frail and elderly. But according to research published on Monday in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, that narrative was actually probably wrong. This research carried out at the University of Colorado and McMaster University in Ontario found that actually people who had pre-existing conditions such as tuberculosis, cancer, malnutrition were far more likely to end up dead as a result of the flu than their healthy counterparts.
Yeah, so Guy, the paper said, and I quote, "We should never expect any non-accidental cause of death to be indiscriminate." Are we basically learning that the mystery that surrounded the Spanish flu or the 1918 flu wasn't actually that much of a mystery at all? It attacked people in the way that we would anticipate all illness does.
Yeah, it sounds like it. I'm looking at a report at the New York Times, which very interesting says that people older than 30 or 40 might well have been exposed to a similar virus that had given them protection. And that's potentially one of the reasons, as well as what Holden said about people with pre-existing conditions, why maybe people in their 20s and 30s were dying from it, because they hadn't had that protection. We, of course, had the vaccines, didn't we, this time with COVID? And there's something else that's very interesting just reading about this, how with a lot of killer viruses, you get a U-curve in terms of death rates. So people at the front, i.e. very young babies who don't have an adequate immune system, and the elderly are the ones most likely to die most of the case. This had a W curve, so people in the middle were dying, and we're now learning, aren't we, potentially some of the reasons as to why, whether as Holden says, people with pre-existing conditions, and obviously we didn't have the medical advances we have now. Some people probably didn't know they had cancer when they had cancer. People that maybe didn't have the protection of having been exposed to this sort of virus because of their age. They just haven't lived long enough to have had those protections and to have had those antibodies. So it's very interesting, and I like the quote you mentioned, Arion, about no non-accidental virus is actually indiscriminate. It sounds like in this case it was discriminate. We just didn't know enough at the time.
I mean, I presume this new information is going to be able to contribute to the way that we tackle pandemics in the future. But before we get to that, Rebekah, I wonder if we could just sort of speculate on why it is that the 1918 pandemic or the Spanish flu isn't as well remembered as perhaps it ought to have been.
Yeah, I think this is really interesting historically. I mean, we know from the dates that the pandemic coincided with the end of the First World War, and we all know that that was described as the Great War because the loss of life was something that had never been seen before. And historians chose to focus on the war rather than the flu, despite that the impact that the flu had on the war. I think the difference between, if we're looking at the 1918 flu versus the war and how that's viewed in the collective consciousness, from my old English literature days, it made me think of a poem by Wilfred Owen, which is Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori, how sweet and fitting it is to die for one's country. And I think the war, people felt like they were dying for a reason, like a higher cause. And I think that's probably more likely to be remembered compared to mass death in a pandemic, which is essentially for no reason. Now, I'm not saying that that's fair, but I just think that that's the way it is. And also grief is something that's very collective, and we can't come together during pandemics to remember those we've lost because of social distancing and other factors that we have to consider there as well.
Yeah, I mean, part of the thing that is being speculated on with this new discovery, Holden, I think, is that, the arrival of a new pandemic, specifically COVID-19, has given us pause to, finally go back and revisit 1918 and learn the lessons that maybe we failed to learn then. Is this the opportunity to learn from that? And is it also an opportunity to go, look, we didn't learn lessons last time round. We really need to think carefully about what we're learning from COVID-19 as well?
I think there's sort of several ways of approaching that question, because I think one of the criticisms of governments and international organizations in the early days of COVID was they had plans in place for a flu pandemic, and a flu pandemic was the thing that kept virologists up at night, and I think to a great extent is still the big worry for people involved in planning for these kind of emergency situations, because the fatality rate of flu is so much higher than it is for coronaviruses. And so I think the people want to look back at those early days of how we were responding to COVID, and some of the criticisms that are coming out through the COVID inquiry here and elsewhere is that people stuck too rigidly to the lessons that had been learned from flu. I think there's now a concern that actually, if we look too closely at what happened in 2020 and during COVID, that we may end up moving too far away from that initial flu pandemic. And if the next pandemic that comes around is actually influenza of some variety, then we don't want to be too rigid in looking for lessons from the past. We need to apply principles, certainly, and there's plenty we can take from it. But there are also specifics that are attached to each disease, and this research just shows reveals a little bit more detail about who was vulnerable, how that vulnerability manifested itself, how the virus was spread around the world through troop movements, amongst other factors, and why governments at that point were reluctant to impose restrictions, either because they were building arms in factories for the war, or afterwards because they didn't want to restrict the movement of soldiers back home for very understandable reasons. So yes, I think it's another piece of information in this tapestry that we will need to be able to sort of digest and apply to our planning for emergencies.
And I presume in relation to that planning for emergencies, Guy, we can now put to bed the idea that if there is a future flu pandemic, it's going to attack people in the indiscriminate way that previously we had thought it did, that it would attack people who were perfectly healthy. We can now assume that, like COVID-19, it's going to target the immunocompromised. It's going to target those with underlying health conditions, and also the whole business of socioeconomic disadvantage. So is that going to be the way that we can learn for the future? Is that going to colour our response next time?
I think only really a virologist or a doctor could answer that with any sense of complete accuracy, but it certainly appears from this new data that there is more chance that a future pandemic is more likely to target those who are more vulnerable. But of course, we just don't know what's around the corner, do we? And, again, a bit like the housing question, we don't have a crystal ball to know precisely. But I think it's not just about how viruses mutate and operate and attack the body. It's also about, learning from, were lockdowns the right thing? Was social distancing the right thing? Did we need masks? Now, of course, the nature of any future virus will also have an impact on some of those questions, because, again, we don't know what they'll look like. But we'll obviously, if something were to happen in the next 20 or 30 years, I suspect we'd use the learnings of COVID-19. Beyond that, a bit like we've forgotten about the Spanish flu, who knows whether the next generation will forget about COVID-19? I don't know.
I suppose the other thing that we could potentially consider from this new research is whether more of this quasi-archaeological investigation should be being done, to solve problems that we think we have previously put to bed. I mean, Rebekah, should we be looking back at the past and going, okay, well, this is what we thought of the Spanish flu, and it turns out that wasn't entirely accurate. Should we revisit other moments from our own history to learn from them in the way that this investigation did, digging out literal skeletons and learning from those?
Sure. I mean, it makes me think about the quote, if we don't learn from history, we're doomed to repeat it, right? So as we're making developments and, scientific breakthroughs, I think looking back at history can only be helpful in various spheres to kind of help us to, as you say, learn those lessons and apply what we know now to perhaps the developments that they didn't have then. And it might, as this study has clearly done, open up whole other realms of possibilities and perhaps help us to be less complacent and forewarned and forearmed about how we can tackle these things in the future. Definitely.
Okay. Well, that's all we have time for this week, I'm afraid. My thanks to Holden, Rebekah, and Guy. And you can follow this show for free and get every episode as soon as it's released by searching for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts and tapping follow. And you can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine, by the way, with a trial subscription. Just go to theweek.co.uk/subscribe. In the meantime, I've been Arion McNicoll. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.